He didn't knock. That was the first thing Elena Voss noticed. Not the rain soaking through his jacket, not the two men who materialized like shadows at the restaurant's back exit, not even the folder he placed on the table with the precise care of a man who had done this exact thing dozens of times before. What she noticed, standing barefoot on the cold tile floor of her family's restaurant at 2 in the morning, was that Roman Calder hadn't knocked. He had simply appeared, the way disasters always do, without warning, without invitation, without any regard for the life currently being dismantled around the person who has to survive it. Outside, one by one, the lights in her father's building across the street were going out. If you were standing in Elena's shoes right now, no money, no allies, a man like Roman Calder across the table, and 48 hours to decide your entire future, what would you do? Stay with this story to the very end, because nothing is what it appears to be. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. We release cinematic stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what's coming. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that restaurant. Elena had been awake since midnight. She hadn't planned it that way. She'd gone to bed at 11, told herself everything would look different in the morning, that the calls from the bank were a clerical error, that the foreclosure notice attached to her father's main building was some kind of administrative mistake that a single phone call would untangle. She'd actually believed it long enough to pull the covers up and close her eyes. Then her phone rang. It was Marcus, their accountant, and his voice was doing the thing voices do when the person speaking them is trying very hard not to fall apart. He told her the accounts had been frozen, all of them. Not just the restaurant's operating account, all of them. The savings her father had built over 30 years. The LLC account that held the payroll for 42 employees. The emergency fund Elena had personally set up 3 years ago after a kitchen fire nearly took everything. Frozen. Every single one. She'd driven to the restaurant in sweatpants and a jacket. She grabbed off the hook by the door, her hair still half pinned from dinner, and she'd spent the next 2 hours on the phone with people who kept telling her there was nothing they could do until morning. The bank's fraud department. Their attorney, who said he needed to review the documents first. A financial consultant her father had used for years, who said, and this was the part that made her stomach drop, that he wasn't sure he could continue to represent the Voss family given the current situation. She'd asked what that meant. He'd said he'd have someone reach out. No one reached out. She was standing at the window watching the building across the street, her father's property, the one that held 3 commercial tenants and produced the bulk of the family's non-restaurant income, when she noticed the lights. They went dark in sequence, floor by floor. Not a power outage, a shutdown. Someone had gone through and physically switched them off. She pressed her forehead to the glass. That was when the black SUV pulled up. She didn't recognize it. There were 2 of them, actually. One blocking the front, one she couldn't see but heard pulling around to the alley. The men who got out moved like they'd been trained to move in the dark. Quiet. Deliberate. Not panicked, not hurried, comfortable. Roman Calder was the last one out. She knew who he was. Everyone in this city knew who Roman Calder was, the same way everyone knew the name of the river that ran through downtown or the family that had built City Hall 2 generations ago. Not because you went looking for the information, but because it was simply part of the landscape. You absorbed it. Roman Calder, 41 years old, built his first legitimate real estate portfolio at 26, controlled half the city's waterfront development, was rumored, always rumored, never proven, to also control a great deal more than that. Appeared in the business section of the city paper 3 or 4 times a year, usually in connection with some charitable endowment or zoning approval. Never the crime section, never anywhere that could be pointed to. He walked through the rain without hurrying. His jacket was good, clearly expensive, clearly tailored, and he wore it the way men wear clothes when they stopped caring what anyone thought of them sometime in their mid-30s. He didn't look at the building across the street. He didn't look at the men flanking him. He looked at the restaurant window. He looked directly at Elena. She stepped back from the glass before she could stop herself. He came in through the front door, which she had not unlocked, and which she was now very certain she had locked before her phone call with Marcus began. She heard the lock turn from the outside. She heard his footsteps cross the dining room, unhurried, moving between tables in the dark, the way someone moves through a room they've already memorized. He stopped on the other side of the prep counter and set the folder on the surface between them. "I apologize for the hour," he said. His voice was even, not loud, not soft. The voice of someone who had learned that volume was a tool amateurs used. "I would have preferred to do this earlier, but there were arrangements to finalize." Elena stared at him. She was aware that her hands were shaking slightly. She was also aware that she was absolutely not going to let him see that. "You need to leave." "I understand that's your preference." He didn't move. "I also understand you've been on the phone for the last 2 hours trying to reach someone who can help you, and that every person you've called has either declined or gone quiet. That's not coincidence. I want you to understand that before we talk." She felt the cold settle deeper into her chest. "What did you do?" "Nothing irreversible." He pushed the folder slightly forward across the counter. "Not yet." She didn't touch it. "Who are you to walk into my family's restaurant at 2 in the morning and put a folder on my counter?" "Roman Calder." He said it without any particular emphasis. Just the name offered the way you'd state a fact. "Your father knows who I am. I suspect you do as well." She did. She kept her face level. "What's in the folder?" "A proposal." She laughed, and the sound came out harsher than she intended, ragged at the edges in a way that embarrassed her. "A proposal. A contract, more precisely." He watched her the way people watch things they've spent a long time thinking about, not greedily, almost carefully. "A marriage contract." The word landed in the space between them and sat there. Elena stared at him for a full 3 seconds before she could process what he'd said, and even then her brain kept sliding off it, rejecting the sentence the way a body rejects something foreign. "I'm sorry. Your family's financial situation is not recoverable through conventional means," he said. "Every institution they rely on has been advised to withdraw support. Every attorney who might file an injunction has been made unavailable. The foreclosure proceedings on 3 properties will advance Monday morning, and the restaurant license renewal, which I believe you've been waiting on for 6 weeks, will be denied." Each item he listed was another wall closing in, and he said all of it with the same even, uninflected calm, the same way you'd read a weather report. "Marry me," he continued. "The accounts are unfrozen by morning. The foreclosure notices disappear. Your license is approved within the week. Your family's financial situation is not merely stabilized, it's secured, for good." "And if I don't?" He didn't smile exactly. The corners of his mouth moved in a way that communicated he'd anticipated the question. "By Monday morning, your family loses it all." She stood there and looked at him, this man she had never met, this name that existed in the city the way certain weather patterns existed. Inevitable, impersonal, always moving somewhere you couldn't predict. "Get out," she said. Roman Calder picked up the folder, tucked it under his arm, and nodded once. "You have 48 hours. He walked back through the dark dining room and out the front door, and his men disappeared with him, and the SUVs pulled away from the curb without hurry, and Elena stood alone in her family's kitchen with her heart slamming in her chest, and the building across the street still dark, and the absolute certainty that none of this was a mistake, none of this was a misunderstanding, none of this was going to be fixed with a phone call. She put both hands flat on the prep counter and breathed. Then she opened her laptop and started making calls. By 6 in the morning, she had called 11 people and reached 3 of them. The first was her cousin Dara, who was a paralegal and who agreed, in a voice that was too careful, too measured, to look into the foreclosure notices, but who called back 40 minutes later to say that the filing firm had already been contacted by a third party and that she needed to recuse herself from any involvement with the Voss family's legal situation. Elena asked what third party. Dara said she didn't know. Her voice said she did know and was scared. The second was a man named Garrett Cole, an investor who had partnered with her father on a development project 4 years earlier and who owed the family more than money. Garrett picked up on the first ring, which told Elena he'd been expecting her call or someone's call, and he said, very quietly, that he was sorry, that he couldn't be involved in this, that she should do whatever the man was asking her to do. Elena asked which man. Garrett said he had to go. The third was her father. His name was Daniel Voss, and he was 63 years old, and he had built everything they had from a single diner his own father had left him in a neighborhood that no one had wanted. He answered the phone sounding like he hadn't slept in days, which Elena recognized because it was the same way she currently sounded, and she told him what had happened, all of it, the accounts, the foreclosure, the restaurant, Roman Calder, and his folder, and his 48 hours. And her father went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of a man who was processing information. It was the quiet of a man who already knew. "Dad," she said, "what's going on?" "Come home," he said. "I'll explain what I can." She drove to the house in the gray early morning, the city still mostly asleep around her, and sat across from her father at the kitchen table where she'd done homework as a child. And he told her things that rearranged the last 10 years of her life in the time it took to drink 1 cup of coffee. He had borrowed money from Roman Calder. Not recently, 7 years ago, when the restaurant district project was on the verge of collapse and every legitimate bank had turned him away. He'd been introduced through an intermediary, a man named Sable, who arranged the meeting and who had seemed, at the time, like a fixer, a connector, the kind of person who knew everyone and collected favors like other people collected debts. The loan had been substantial, the terms had been private, and he had paid it back, all of it, with interest over 4 years, and he had believed afterward that the chapter was closed. Elena sat across from her father and worked very hard to keep her voice level. "You borrowed millions of dollars from a man like Roman Calder, and you didn't tell us." Daniel Voss looked at his coffee cup. "I paid it back." "That's not the point." "I know that." She stood up. She walked to the window and looked at the street, at the morning light coming through the tree in the front yard, at the completely ordinary neighborhood that had been completely ordinary her entire life, and that now felt like a set someone had built around her. "Okay," she said, "the debt is paid. So why does he have leverage over us?" "I don't know," her father said. She turned and looked at him. "Are you telling me the truth?" He didn't answer immediately, and that half-second gap was the most frightening thing she had heard all morning. "I'm telling you what I know," he said. She drove back to the restaurant. She spent the next 6 hours doing things she'd never done before. She hired a private records researcher, someone her father's old attorney had mentioned years ago, a woman named Pell, who operated out of a building downtown and who accepted cash and asked no questions. And she asked her to pull everything she could find on Roman Calder's corporate holdings, his LLCs, his property transactions, anything that touched the Voss family interests in the last decade. She contacted 2 more attorneys. One told her there was a conflict of interest. The other said he'd call her back and didn't. She went to the bank in person and sat across from the branch manager, a man named Whitford, who had attended her parents' 20th anniversary party, who had shaken her hand at her college graduation, who had known her since she was 11 years old. He looked at her across the desk with the expression of a man who has been told to do something he knows is wrong and has decided to do it anyway. He told her the account freeze was the result of an ongoing financial review that he was not at liberty to discuss. He told her the timeline was uncertain. He told her he was sorry. She asked him if he was. He looked at his desk. She walked out. By 4 in the afternoon, she was sitting in the back office of the restaurant with Pell's preliminary report spread across the table, and she was looking at something she hadn't expected to find. She'd expected financial structures, shell companies, the architecture of organized money. She found all of that. But buried inside the Calder corporate filings, deep in the subsidiary structure, several layers removed from anything that bore Roman's name directly, she found something else. Transaction records tied to a series of accounts that had been moving money into and out of Voss family-adjacent businesses for the last 9 months. Not large movements. Careful ones. The kind of movements designed to look like ordinary business activity to anyone who wasn't looking closely. The accounts were fronts. She was certain of it, and they were not Roman Calder's accounts. They were registered to a holding company whose sole officer was listed as V. Sable, the same name her father had mentioned that morning, the man who had arranged the introduction to Calder 7 years ago. She sat there a long time. Then her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Ms. Voss." The voice was male, unhurried, almost pleasant. "I understand you've been having a difficult day. I wanted to let you know that the difficulties you're experiencing are not the result of the situation you believe them to be. You're looking at the wrong person." "Who is this?" A pause. "Someone who is watching the same situation you are, from a different position. I'd suggest you stop making calls. The people you're reaching out to have been warned, and every contact you make is being logged. The line went dead. She set the phone down slowly. Someone was watching her make calls. Someone had already anticipated her first moves. Someone who was not Roman Calder and was, apparently, not on Roman Calder's side. She picked up Pell's report again and stared at the name at the bottom of the holding company filing. V. Sable. She had 42 hours left. She went to Roman's office. Not to accept. She was clear on that. Whatever else happened, she was not walking in there waving a white flag. She went because the anonymous call had shaken something loose in her thinking, because the transaction records didn't line up the way she'd expected them to, and because the only move she could see was to look at Roman Calder up close and try to figure out what exactly he was actually doing. His main corporate office was in a building downtown that didn't have his name on it. She knew the address from Pell's report. She told herself she was going to ask questions, not answer them. He was waiting for her. That was the first thing wrong. The receptionist didn't ask her name or make a call. She simply stood when Elena walked in and said, "He's expecting you," and led her down a hallway with the practiced calm of someone who had been told exactly when and how a specific visitor would arrive. Elena filed that away. It told her something. Roman's office was not what she'd imagined. She'd built a picture in her head of dark wood and controlled lighting and the kind of decor that announces power before the person in the room has to. What she found instead was something more like a working space. Papers on the desk, 2 monitors running feeds she couldn't read from across the room, a whiteboard along one wall covered in handwriting, a jacket thrown over the back of a chair. The only thing that matched her expectation was the window. It faced east, and at this hour the city below it was just beginning to show its evening lights, and Roman Calder was standing in front of it with his arms crossed, looking out, when she walked in. He turned when he heard her. "You came," he said. "I have questions," she said, "not an answer." "I know." He moved to the desk but didn't sit. He picked up a pen, set it back down. She noticed his hands, not soft, not manicured, hands that had worked at something before they'd learned to sign documents. "What did you find?" She hadn't expected that. "What makes you think I found anything?" "Because you came here in person instead of calling." He looked at her directly. "You found something that didn't fit your assumption about me. It changed the shape of the problem enough that you needed to see my face when you asked about it." She hated that he was right. She held his gaze anyway. "V. Sable. Victor Sable. He arranged your introduction to my father 7 years ago, and I found 9 months of financial movements tied to his holding companies inside businesses connected to my family." She paused. "That's not your operation, is it?" Something moved across Roman's face. It wasn't surprise, but she got the sense that Roman Calder had stopped being surprised by new information sometime long ago. It was more like confirmation, the look of a man checking a box he'd already suspected existed. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." He nodded, accepting that. "What I'm about to tell you is going to change what you think you understand about your family's situation. I'm telling you now because you've already gotten close enough to the edge of this that keeping you uninformed becomes dangerous." "Dangerous for who?" "For you." He said it flatly, without theatrical weight. Just a fact. "Victor Sable is my second in command. He has been for 11 years. He is also, as of approximately 8 months ago, actively working to take apart everything I've built, my organization, my assets, my alliances, and reconstruct it under his own control." Elena stared at him. "The financial moves you found aren't aimed at me," Roman continued. "They're aimed at you, your family, because someone in your family's history has access to something that could expose what Victor has been doing for years. Not just the current play, but everything behind it. Records, evidence, proof of a financial architecture that touches people in this city who would spend significant resources to ensure it never became public." She didn't speak. "I didn't come to your restaurant last night to punish your family," he said. "I came because the legal protection offered by a marriage contract is the fastest mechanism I have for making you and your father unreachable to the people Victor has already started moving against you. That's it. That's the entire reason." "You expect me to believe that?" "No," he said. "I expect you to verify it, which you're already doing." He pushed a thin folder across the desk toward her. "That's 8 months of internal communications I've intercepted from Victor's people. Read it, then tell me what you think." She looked at the folder. She looked at him. She picked it up. She didn't open it in his office. She took it under her arm and walked back to the door, and she stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. "If you knew Sable was moving against you," she said, "why haven't you stopped him?" Roman Calder looked at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not quite tired, not quite resigned, something in between that looked like a man carrying weight he'd long since accepted as permanent. "Because the moment I move against Victor openly, every person he's already turned inside my organization moves at once," he said. "And I don't know yet how many that is." She left without answering. In the elevator, going down, she opened the folder. The first page was a surveillance photograph. It was dated 18 months ago. It was a photograph of her. She was walking out of a coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment. She was carrying a bag and looking at her phone. It was a completely ordinary moment from a completely ordinary day, and someone had been watching her, had photographed her, and the image had ended up in a file inside Roman Calder's office. 18 months ago. Long before the accounts were frozen, long before the foreclosure notices, long before Roman Calder walked through her restaurant door in the rain. She stared at it all the way down to the lobby. She was still staring at it when the elevator opened and she walked out into the building's entrance, and the city evening was loud around her, and her phone buzzed in her pocket with a message from a number she didn't recognize. It said, "Stop looking. They already know you've been to see him." She stood on the sidewalk in the evening crowd with the photograph in her hand and the folder under her arm, and the cold certainty settling into her that this situation was not what Roman Calder had made it look like, and it was not what she had believed it to be, and the 48-hour clock was still running, and somewhere in the financial records of her family's history was something that multiple very powerful people were prepared to do serious harm to access. She needed to find it first. She flagged a cab. She did not go home. The cab dropped her 6 blocks from her apartment. She walked the rest of the way, not because she wanted the air, but because she needed to think without walls around her, and the cold was sharp enough to cut through the static that had been building behind her eyes since 2 in the morning. The folder was tucked inside her jacket. The photograph was at the top. 18 months. She kept coming back to that. Not 8 months, when Victor Sable had apparently begun his internal campaign against Roman. Not 4 months ago, when the first quiet financial pressure had started accumulating around her family's accounts. 18 months. Whoever had taken that photograph had been watching her a full year before any of this began, before Roman walked into her restaurant, before the lights in her father's building went dark, before she'd ever heard the name Victor Sable spoken aloud. That meant the timeline she'd been building in her head was wrong. The sequence she'd constructed, a debt, pressure, ultimatum, was not the actual sequence. Something had started long before the part she knew about, and she was still on the outside of it. She got home, locked the deadbolt and the chain, and spread everything across the kitchen table. Pell's financial report, Roman's folder, the photograph face up in the center. She spent 2 hours going through it. By midnight, she had 3 things she was certain of, and a 4th that she couldn't make herself believe yet. The first certainty. Victor Sable had been systematically moving money through shell accounts adjacent to Voss family businesses for 9 months. Not stealing from them, moving through them, using the Voss corporate structure as a conduit, a layer of distance between transactions that would otherwise be too visible. The second certainty. The accounts had been accessed using forged authorization signatures. Her father's signature and one other, her mother's. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. The third certainty. Whatever the transactions were hiding, the end destination was a holding structure that Roman's intercepted communications identified only as the ledger, not a specific account, a document. Physical or digital, she couldn't tell. Something that had existed long enough that it was referred to in the communications as a known quantity, not described, just referenced, the way you reference something everyone in the room already understands. The fourth thing, the one she couldn't hold steady in her mind, was the date on the communication that mentioned the ledger most directly. It was dated 9 days after her mother's death. She sat with that for a long time. She sat with it until her coffee went cold and the city outside her window went quiet. The way it only went quiet between 3 and 4 in the morning, and then she put the papers back in order and got 3 hours of sleep and woke up with 26 hours left on Roman Calder's clock. She called her father at 7. He answered on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. Mom's signature is on the forged documents, she said. She didn't build up to it. There wasn't time for building up to things anymore. Someone used her name on financial authorizations 9 months ago, 11 years after she died. I need you to tell me what that means. Silence on the line. Not the silence of a man processing new information, the other kind. Dad? Come to the house, he said. No, tell me right now. Another beat of silence. Then, your mother worked with some people before she died. Before she met me, actually, and for a while after. People who moved money through networks that weren't legal, Elena. I want you to understand that she left that world before you were born. She left it completely. But she left it with documentation. Records she kept because she was afraid, because the people she'd worked with were the kind of people you keep records on if you want to stay safe. Elena's hand was tight around the phone. What kind of records? Everything, her father said, and his voice was quiet and heavy with the weight of something he'd been carrying alone for a very long time. Financial flows, names, transaction structures going back to the late 90s. Some of the people whose names are in those records are still operating, still in this city, still powerful enough that if those records became public, the consequences would be, Elena, the consequences would be significant. Where are the records? Silence. Dad, where are they? I don't know, he said, and this time she believed him, and somehow that was worse than if he'd been lying. She told me they existed. She told me they were somewhere safe. She died before she told me where. Elena pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. And someone knows they exist. Someone has known for at least 18 months, maybe longer, and they think our family has access to them. Yes. And Victor Sable is one of those people. A pause. I don't know that name? He introduced you to Roman Calder 7 years ago. He arranged the loan. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. This one was the sound of a man realizing that a shape he'd been looking at his entire life had just revealed itself to be something entirely different than what he'd believed. He said his name was Marcus Webb, her father said, the man who arranged the introduction. Elena closed her eyes. Same man, different name, of course. Stay home, she told her father. Lock the doors. Don't let anyone in that you don't know, and call me before you let in anyone you do know. I mean, anyone. Elena, I'm handling it. She hung up and called Pell. Pell met her at a diner 3 blocks from the financial district, arriving 6 minutes after Elena, sliding into the booth across from her with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped being rattled by the content of her work. She was somewhere in her late 50s, with short gray hair and the kind of eyes that recorded things without commenting on them. Elena put the folder on the table between them and pointed to the holding company structure at the bottom of page 4. I need the real ownership chain on this, not the registered front. The actual people behind the LLC. Pell looked at it for 30 seconds. This is going to take time I don't have today. I need it in 4 hours. Pell looked up. That's not how this works. I know how it works, Elena said. I'm telling you what I need. Something in Elena's face apparently communicated the severity of the situation in terms Pell found credible, because the older woman looked back at the page, pulled it closer, and said, I can get you a partial chain in 4 hours. The deep end may take another day. I don't have another day. Then you'll work with partial. Pell folded the page and tucked it into her own bag. There's something else you should know. I was running the standard background sweep on Calder last night, and I found something I wasn't looking for. She reached into the bag and produced a single printed page, which she placed on the table. That's a property record, a building in the Garfield district, commercial space, registered to a Calder subsidiary, but the last documented physical inspection was 18 months ago. Elena looked at the address. And, she said, and the inspection was conducted by an assessor whose license number traces back to a company that also appears in your Sable holding structure. Pell tapped the page. Someone connected to Sable went into a Calder property 18 months ago, around the time that photograph of you was taken. Elena stared at the address on the page. The Garfield building, a Calder property that someone connected to Victor Sable had accessed 18 months ago. Can you get me access to that building? She said. Pell looked at her with the flat, patient expression of a woman who had heard a great many requests she considered inadvisable. I can get you the door code from the property management records. What you do with it is your business. She went that afternoon. She told herself she was going to look. Just look. She was not going to touch anything. She was not going to take anything. She was going to observe and leave and make decisions based on what she found rather than acting on instinct in a situation where instinct was the most dangerous guide she had. The Garfield building was a 4-story commercial structure wedged between a parking structure and a dry cleaner, the kind of building that existed in cities by the thousands, functional, anonymous, generating just enough income to justify its continued existence without ever becoming visible. The lobby code Pell had given her worked. The elevator worked. The third floor, where the inspection had been logged, had a hallway that smelled of dust and sealed air, the smell of a space that no one used regularly. The third door on the left was unlocked. She pushed it open. The room was empty except for a metal shelving unit bolted to the back wall and a workstation that had been stripped of its computer equipment but still had its cables trailing loose across the desk. Someone had been here, used this space for something, and then removed the most identifiable elements of whatever operation it had been. She moved to the shelving unit. There was nothing on the shelves, but at the back of the third shelf, when she ran her hand along the surface, her fingers found a groove in the wall behind the unit. She leaned closer. It was a seam, not a crack, a deliberate seam, the edge of a panel that had been fitted carefully but not perfectly into the wall. She worked her fingers into the seam. It took a minute. Then the panel shifted. Behind it was a cavity about the size of a microwave, and in the cavity was a single object, a black external hard drive, taped to the back wall with electrical tape, connected to nothing. She looked at it a long time. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway. She didn't stop to think. She pressed the panel back into place, stepped away from the shelving unit, and moved toward the door. It opened before she reached it. The man who walked in was not one of Roman's people. She knew that immediately, the same way you know certain things before your brain has processed the evidence. He moved wrong. He looked at the room rather than at her first. His eyes did a fast sweep of the space and found the shelving unit before they found her face. He was looking for something. He had come here to look for the same thing she'd found. He looked at her. "You're the Voss woman," he said. Not a question. "Who are you?" she said. He had a phone in his hand. He was already dialing as he answered. "Someone who got here about 30 seconds too late." He said 3 words into the phone. She caught 2 of them. "She's here." She ran. She made it down the stairwell and out the side exit and into the alley before anyone else appeared, and she walked fast. Not running, because running draws attention, and the street was not empty. Toward the cross street, her heart doing something violent in her chest. The hard drive not in her hands because she'd been smart enough not to take it, which meant it was still in the wall, which meant whoever had sent that man would send someone back for it, and the window she had to do something useful with that information was closing fast. She ducked into a coffee shop on the corner and stood in the back by the restrooms and called Roman Calder. He picked up on the second ring. "I found something," she said. "In the Garfield building, 3rd floor, 3rd door left. Behind the shelving unit on the back wall, there's a cavity with a hard drive. I didn't take it. Someone else showed up. He called someone when he saw me. Your people need to get there before whoever he called sends someone to pull it." Silence on the other end for 2 full seconds. "How did you find that building?" Roman said. "Through the property assessment records. Victor Sable's people did an inspection there 18 months ago." Another pause. Then, "Are you all right?" It was such a specific question that it caught her off guard. Not what did you see, not describe the man. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "The drive. Can you get there?" "I have people 4 minutes away." She heard him moving, heard a door. "Don't go back there." "I wasn't planning to." "Elena." He said her name the way he said most things. Level, without performance. "What you just found, if it's what I think it is, changes the situation considerably. I need you to come in." "Come in where?" "Somewhere I can guarantee your safety." "Not my office. Victor has eyes on that building. There's an address in the financial district, 17 Caldwell. The parking structure on the 2nd level, Bay 7. 1 hour." She stood in the back of the coffee shop and looked at the wall and thought about how many ways this could be a setup, and how many ways it might not be, and how little time she had left to operate on the assumption that she could manage this alone. 1 hour, she said. She hung up. Her hands were steady. She noticed that and found it strange. Everything inside her felt like a wire under too much current, but her hands were perfectly still, and she stood there a moment thinking that this was probably what it felt like when your body finally accepted that the emergency was not temporary, that this was simply the situation now, and that falling apart was a luxury that didn't fit the available schedule. She ordered a coffee she didn't drink and sat by the window for 20 minutes, watching the street. Nobody followed her to Caldwell. Bay 7 was dim and smelled of exhaust and concrete. Roman was already there, standing beside a car she didn't recognize, with one other person. A woman, 40s, short-cropped dark hair, the posture of someone trained to stand in ways that kept all exits visible simultaneously. He looked at Elena when she walked in with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. "The drive is gone," he said without preamble. "My people got there in 6 minutes. The panel was open and the cavity was empty." Elena felt the floor shift slightly. Someone beat them. By less than 4 minutes. His jaw was tight, which means whoever the man you encountered called had people closer to that building than I did, which means they knew about the space. They weren't looking for it. They knew exactly where to go. He paused. They were watching to see if anyone else would find it first. "They were watching me," Elena said, "probably from the moment you hired Pell." She absorbed that. "So they let me find it. And then they took it before I could retrieve it." Roman looked past her for a moment, working through something. The woman beside him hadn't moved or spoken. "The drive is Victor's now, which means whatever is on it, it's not what he wants." Elena said it before she'd finished forming the thought, and when she said it aloud, she knew it was right. "He's been using forged versions of my mother's signature for 9 months. If he had the original documentation, whatever my mother kept, he wouldn't need to forge anything. He'd have the real thing. The hard drive is operational intelligence, maybe, communications. But the original evidence my mother compiled, the actual records she kept, he doesn't have those." She looked at Roman. "That's what this is really about." Roman looked at her steadily. "Your mother," he said, and the way he said it, carefully, with a weight that didn't match someone hearing new information, made the back of Elena's neck go cold. "What do you know about my mother?" she said. The woman beside Roman shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, and Roman was quiet for exactly long enough that Elena understood she had just identified the edge of something she had not known was there. "Her name was Catherine Aldrin before she married your father," Roman said. "She worked inside a financial network in this city for 3 years in the early 90s. She left when she had enough evidence to make herself untouchable by the people she'd worked with. She disappeared from that world and built a different life." He paused. "My father helped her disappear." The concrete structure felt very still. "Your father," Elena said. "He was operating then in a capacity similar to what I do now. He respected what she was doing, exposing that network, and he had reasons of his own to want certain people in it to lose power. He helped her create a new identity infrastructure, relocate her assets, establish the life she built with your father." Roman held her gaze. "Which means my organization has known about your mother's documentation for 30 years. And Victor Sable, who has been inside my organization for 11 years, has had access to that institutional knowledge for most of that time." Elena stood very still. "You knew," she said. "Before you came to the restaurant, you knew who my mother was." "I knew the history," he said. "I didn't know where the documentation was, which is the same position I've been in for years. Victor has spent those same years trying to find it. And the marriage contract." Her voice was flat and controlled in the way things are controlled when the alternative is something worse. "Was that ever actually about protection? Or was that about putting me somewhere you could watch me while I led you to what you couldn't find yourself?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds long, which was 2 seconds longer than it needed to be if the answer was simple. "Both things can be true," Roman said. "That is not an answer. It's the honest one." He held her gaze without flinching, without the performance of remorse, without the carefully shaped expression of a man managing a situation. Just a man telling a hard truth poorly. "When I came to your restaurant, I believed your family was in danger and that the contract was the fastest legal protection available. I also knew that if Victor moved against you directly, you would start investigating, and that you were more likely to find the documentation than anyone I could put on the search. Both things were true at the same time." Elena looked at him for a long, silent moment. "You used me," she said. "I protected you and used you simultaneously," he said. "I understand if that distinction doesn't help." It didn't help. She turned away from him and looked at the gray concrete wall and breathed, and the 23 hours remaining on his clock felt like a perverse joke at this point. A deadline that had been meaningless from the beginning. A structure imposed on a situation that had never actually been structured the way he'd presented it. "The documentation my mother left," she said, still looking at the wall. "If Victor gets to it first, what happens? He destroys the elements that implicate him and uses the rest as leverage over the people in this city whose names appear in it. That leverage translates into power, say, over my organization, over city government, over the financial infrastructure that makes this city function. Victor's play isn't just to take what I've built. It's to take everything she documented and turn it into a permanent mechanism of control." She turned back. "And if we get to it first?" "Then Victor's operation collapses. The people in those records get exposed or get scared enough to distance themselves from him. His internal support inside my organization evaporates. And what happens to my family?" "Your family is safe," he said. That part was never conditional. She studied his face. She didn't trust it. She also couldn't find the lie in it, and she had spent enough of the last 20 hours looking for lies that she thought she'd gotten reasonably good at locating them. "I need to know where my mother hid those records," she said. "That's the only thing that matters right now." "I know," Roman said, "and I think you're the only person who has a chance of figuring that out." Before she could answer, the woman beside Roman, who had not spoken a word the entire time, held up her phone and said in a low, toneless voice, "He moved." Roman's entire posture changed. "Where?" "Your father's house," the woman said, and looked at Elena. 20 minutes ago, Victor's people put 2 cars outside the property. They're not moving yet, but they're there." Elena was already moving toward the parking structure exit. Roman caught her arm, not hard, just enough to stop her for 1 second. "Don't go there alone." She looked at his hand on her arm. He released it. "Then keep up," she said, and walked into the cold gray afternoon with the certainty of a woman who had run out of time for anything except forward motion, toward the house where her father was sitting with the doors locked and 23 years of secrets and no idea that the people who wanted those secrets were already parked outside his street, waiting for exactly the kind of move she was about to make. Roman's car was faster. She didn't like that. Didn't like being in the passenger seat. Didn't like the implicit concession of letting him drive. Didn't like any of the 17 different ways this arrangement communicated that she was operating inside his logistics now instead of her own. But the alternative was a cab that would take twice as long, and the woman with the short dark hair, Roman had called her Reyes, nothing else, just Reyes, had confirmed that the 2 cars outside her father's house hadn't moved yet, which meant the window was still open, which meant the only thing that mattered was getting there. She watched the city move past the window and kept her breathing even. Roman drove the way he did everything, without excess. No aggression, no hurry that expressed itself in the wrong places, just clean and efficient movement through traffic that opened up ahead of him in a way that felt less like luck and more like the road itself making accommodations. "How many people does Victor have outside the house?" she said. Reyes counted 4 in the 2 vehicles. He checked the mirror. "There may be more we haven't located." "And your people?" 2 cars, 2 blocks out. They'll hold position until I give a different instruction." She turned from the window. "Why are they holding? If Victor's people are outside my father's house, because if my people move on Victor's people in an open residential street, that becomes a different kind of problem." He said it without apology. 4 men sitting in parked cars haven't done anything yet. The moment I send people to remove them, I've started something that doesn't stay contained to that block. She understood the logic. She didn't like it. "And if they move first?" "Then the calculation changes." She looked at her phone. No messages from her father. She told him not to open the door. She hadn't told him why, not specifically, and she was now running through all the ways that incomplete information might cause him to make a wrong decision, to peek out the window, to call someone, to decide the situation had resolved itself and that the locked doors were unnecessary. Her father was not a man who handled waiting well. He never had been. "Tell me about Victor," she said. "Not the operational history. Tell me what he's like." Roman was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, processing. She'd started to recognize the difference. "Patient," he said finally. More patient than almost anyone I've worked with. He can hold a position for years without showing the pressure of holding it. He's also, meticulous isn't the right word. He's thorough in a way that looks like meticulousness, but is actually something colder. He doesn't leave things unfinished because he finds incompletion intolerable. He leaves things unfinished only when finishing them would cost more than waiting. 11 years, she said. You worked with him for 11 years. Yes. And you didn't see this? A beat. I saw pieces of it. I misread what they were connected to. She let that sit. There was something in the way he said it, not defensive, not minimizing, that told her he'd been sitting with that failure for a while already. What made you start looking at him? A financial discrepancy that Reyes flagged 8 months ago, small enough that it should have been administrative error. But Victor's operations don't produce administrative errors. He paused. By the time I understood what I was looking at, he was already 6 months into the current play. The car slowed as they turned onto her father's street, and Roman cut the headlights 2 blocks out, which was the kind of automatic tactical decision that reminded her sharply of the category of person she was sitting next to, the world this was normal inside of. She spotted the 2 cars immediately. Dark sedans, both parked on the same side of the street, engines off. The kind of positioning that looked incidental until you'd been looking at it for 2 seconds. Go around, she said. Back of the house. He turned without asking why. Her father's backyard connected to an alley that ran behind the entire block, a leftover of neighborhood planning from 50 years ago that most people used for trash bins and forgot existed. Elena had grown up climbing the fence at the alley's edge, and she knew exactly where the wood was rotted enough to flex without making noise, and she went through it in the dark with Roman 3 feet behind her while Reyes stayed with the car. The back door was locked. She had a key. She let them in through the kitchen, and her father was sitting at the table exactly where she'd pictured him, hands wrapped around a mug of something that had gone cold. The television in the other room on but muted, every light in the house burning because Daniel Voss dealt with anxiety by eliminating shadows. He looked at her when she came through the door, and then looked at Roman, and something moved across his face that was not surprise. It was recognition, not the recognition of a man who had seen Roman Calder's photograph in a newspaper. The deeper kind. The kind that meant prior knowledge. You know him, Elena said. Her father set the mug down. I knew his father. Roman crossed the kitchen slowly and sat in the chair across from Daniel without being invited, and the 2 men looked at each other across the table with the specific weight of people who share a history that has never been spoken aloud in the same room before. I was 19, her father said, to the table more than to either of them. His father was the only person in this city who agreed to help your mother when she was trying to get out. I met him twice. I never knew his full name. She protected me from that deliberately. She thought the less I knew, the safer I'd be. She was right, Roman said. She was always right. Daniel Voss's hands tightened around the mug. That was its own kind of problem. Elena stood at the kitchen counter and looked at both of them and felt the specific exhaustion of realizing that the situation was significantly older and deeper than she'd understood even an hour ago. Her mother had been connected to Roman's father. Her father had known, at some level, that the connection existed. Roman had known about her family long before the debt, long before the marriage contract, long before the lights went dark across the street. The photograph in the folder, 18 months ago. Did you know he was watching me? She said to her father. Daniel looked up. What? Roman's people. They had surveillance photographs of me from 18 months ago. She held her father's eyes. Did you know? The silence this time was the longest of the night. I asked for it, her father said. Everything in this room went very still. Elena heard her own breathing. She heard the television in the other room, tinny and muted, and the distant movement of traffic 2 streets over, and the blood in her ears. What did you say? About 18 months ago, I started noticing things. Her father's voice was low and even, with the tight control of a man who has rehearsed a confession enough times that he can deliver it without falling apart, though the effort is visible in every muscle. Small things. Someone had been in my office, not broken in, but in, a car that appeared in the same locations too many times. A supplier who started asking questions about our financial structure that had nothing to do with our account with him. He paused. I knew what it meant. It meant someone had started looking for Catherine's documentation through us, which meant the situation I'd been afraid of for 20 years had started moving. So you contacted Roman, Elena said. I contacted an intermediary I'd used once before to reach people I couldn't reach directly. I asked for someone to keep watch on you, to be aware of where you were, who was approaching you, whether anyone connected to these people was making contact. You asked a crime organization to surveil your daughter without telling her. Her father looked at her with eyes that held 20 years of a specific kind of dread, the dread of a parent who has been waiting for a danger to materialize, who has been carrying the weight of it alone because he believed the weight was his to carry. I was trying to protect you, he said. I know that, she said, and she did, and it made precisely no difference. Where is the documentation, Dad? His mouth opened. Before he could answer, the lights went out. All of them. The kitchen, the hallway, the muted television, everything, in a single cut, leaving them in the complete dark of a house that had been bright 2 seconds ago. Roman was out of his chair before Elena had fully processed what happened. She heard him move to the wall beside the window, heard his voice low and immediate into his phone. Reyes, status. She couldn't hear Reyes's answer, but she heard Roman's response. How many? Then, back door, now. He was at her father's arm, pulling the older man upright, and Elena was already at the back door with her hand on the lock when she heard it. Not glass breaking, not a forced entry, but something more measured and deliberate than that. Footsteps on the front porch, multiple sets. And then a knock, 3 times. The casual kind that implied the person on the other side knew perfectly well. No one was going to open the door and was doing it as a formality. Victor's people didn't rush. That was the thing that frightened her most. Roman had her father's arm, Elena had the back door open, and they moved through into the cold alley air, and she pulled the door shut behind them, and for a moment the 3 of them stood in the dark in the alley behind the house, while Roman had a clipped, barely voiced conversation with Reyes about extraction routing. Her father was shaking. Not badly. Just the fine tremor of a 63-year-old man who has been holding himself rigid for too many hours and has reached the limit. She put her hand on his arm and felt the tremor and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would help more than the contact itself. The restaurant, her father said. Elena looked at him. The documentation, he said. I know where it is. I've known for years. I couldn't get to it without drawing attention to the location. His voice was barely above a breath. Your mother hid it inside the restaurant. The original location. The first one, before we expanded. The prep kitchen in the basement. There's a section of the floor under the standing freezer. The tile comes up. She told me a week before she died. She made me promise not to move it until it was necessary. Elena stared at him in the dark alley. You've known for 20 years. She said moving it would be worse than leaving it. She said the only way it stayed safe was if no one could prove I knew where it was. He looked at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and exhausted and entirely her father's. She thought she'd have more time to decide what to do with it herself. Roman finished his call and looked at both of them. We need to move. The original restaurant location, Elena said to him. That's where it is. His expression changed, just slightly, just enough. That building has been empty for 2 years. I know. Victor's people will have eyes on it. Probably. She looked at her father, then back at Roman. But they don't know we know where it is. They've been looking for it for 18 months, and they haven't found it. If we move now, before he has a chance to reposition, it's a risk, Roman said. Everything is a risk. She held his gaze. You said I was the best chance of finding it. I found it. Now I need to get there. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he nodded. They moved her father to a location Roman described only as secure, an apartment above a dry cleaner in a neighborhood that had no visible connection to anyone involved in any of this, with Reyes and one other person Elena hadn't met before, a quiet man named Taro, who moved with the same trained awareness as Reyes and who her father accepted with the weary compliance of a man who had exhausted his capacity for objection. Elena and Roman drove to the original restaurant alone. The building was on Vetter Street, a commercial block that had been gradually losing its tenants over the last decade as the neighborhood's economic center drifted east. The Voss family had operated there for 18 years before the expansion that moved them 6 blocks north, and the building had been empty since they left. Too large for most prospective tenants, too loaded with commercial kitchen infrastructure to convert cheaply, sitting there in the quiet accumulation of an unlived-in space. Roman parked on a side street and they approached on foot. He was scanning continuously, not obviously, not with the jerky paranoia of someone frightened, but with the constant low-level environmental attention of someone for whom reading a street was as automatic as breathing. "Clear," he said quietly when they reached the service entrance at the building's side. The lock had been changed when the building went vacant, but Elena had kept the key her father had given her 3 years ago, which he'd kept because Daniel Voss was constitutionally incapable of relinquishing keys to places that had mattered to him. It still worked. The door opened with the particular friction of a lock that hadn't been turned in a long time. Inside, the building was dark and smelled of sealed air and old grease, and the specific cold that accumulates in spaces where no one generates heat. Elena had been here twice in the 2 years since they'd closed it, and both times it had given her the particular melancholy of a familiar place wearing unfamiliarity, like a coat. Tonight she didn't have room for melancholy. She navigated by memory through the main dining room, chairs still stacked on tables, covered in dust, the geometry of the room unchanged, and through the swinging door into the kitchen and down the stairs at the back into the prep basement. Roman stayed close but didn't crowd her. The prep kitchen was lower than the main kitchen, accessible through a narrow stair, and it was the part of the building that held the original commercial equipment her parents had installed when they first opened. Her mother had worked down here in the early years. Elena had a specific memory of being 6 or 7 years old, sitting on an overturned stock pot, watching her mother prep vegetables on the long steel table, her hands moving with the automatic speed of someone who had done the same movements 10,000 times. She hadn't thought about that memory in years. It arrived now with a force that surprised her, and she pushed it to the side because the alternative was to stand in the dark and fall apart, which was not an option. The standing freezer was in the far left corner, still in position after 2 years. Industrial unit, 6 feet tall, no longer powered. It had been bolted to the wall when it was installed, but the bolts had been removed at some point, she checked, running her hands along the back edge. And the unit sat on its wheels, which meant it could move. She looked at Roman. He positioned himself at the side of the freezer and braced, and she grabbed the front edge, and they moved it. It was heavy, even empty, and the wheels complained against the tile, a sound that seemed enormous in the quiet basement, and Roman paused after the first foot of movement to listen. Nothing. They moved it another 18 inches. The tile underneath was different from the surrounding floor. Elena could feel it before she could see it, her fingers finding the edge where the replacement tile met the original. She pulled out her phone and used the flashlight function, and the seam was clearly visible in the beam. A square approximately 16 inches across, the grout line slightly different in color from the rest of the floor. She worked the edge with her fingers until she found the grip point her mother had apparently built in. A thin lip of tile edge that had been left deliberately ungrouted, just enough clearance to get 2 fingers underneath. She lifted. The tile came up cleanly, in one piece, resting on a thin sheet of cork underneath that had kept it from rattling. Below it was a cavity, maybe 8 inches deep, and inside the cavity was a metal box, the kind that fireproof document boxes come in, sealed with a combination lock. She stared at it. Then she heard something upstairs, a sound that was not the building settling. Footsteps on the main floor. Roman was already at the foot of the stairs, back to the wall, absolutely still. He held up 3 fingers without looking at her. 3 people. She looked at the box, she looked at the stairs. She reached into the cavity and lifted the box out. It was heavier than it looked, which told her it was full, and she tucked it under her arm and looked at Roman, and he shook his head once. Not yet. Stay still. And she could hear the footsteps above moving through the dining room toward the kitchen, and then she heard something else. A voice, carrying through the floor with the distortion of building acoustics, but clear enough. She's already here. Calder's car is on the side street. And then another voice, closer, just above the kitchen door at the top of their stairs. This voice she didn't recognize. But Roman did. She could see it in the way his body changed, a shift so subtle it would have been invisible if she hadn't been watching him with the focus that the last 2 days had sharpened in her. He recognized the voice, and what moved across his face in that half-second was not fear. It was something worse than fear. It was the specific devastation of confirmation. The voice said, "Bring them both up. Victor wants them alive. Elena looked at Roman. His expression had closed down into something flat and operational, the face that functioned when the other faces couldn't afford to. But she had seen that half second, that crack, and she needed to understand it. "Who is that?" she whispered. His jaw moved. He answered with the compressed stillness of a man delivering information he had not yet fully metabolized. Harlan Cross. The name meant nothing to her. "He runs my security operations," Roman said quietly. "Has for 7 years. He's the only person other than me who knows the location of every safe location I control." Elena felt the implications of that land one by one, like stones dropped into still water. The apartment where her father was. Reyes. Taro. The secure location Roman had sent them to that only Harlan Cross could have known about. She gripped the metal box tighter. "Your father," she said. "I know," he said. "We have to—" "I know." He looked at the stair, then at her, and something moved behind his eyes that was closer to the surface than anything she'd seen from him in 2 days of watching him manage himself carefully. "The exit is the coal chute on the east wall, 30 seconds to the alley. Can you run?" "Yes." "The box doesn't leave your hands." "I know." "When I move, you move." She nodded. He moved. The coal chute was exactly where he said it was, a relic of the building's original heating system, accessible through a low door in the east wall of the basement that she had never once noticed in 18 years of working in this building, which told her Roman had, or a scenario like it, which told her something she chose to file away for later. She went through the chute first, metal box clutched to her chest, the tunnel barely wide enough for her shoulders, emerging into the cold alley air on hands and knees, the rough concrete of the exit catching her palms. She was up before Roman was fully out, and they were moving down the alley before the sounds from inside the building resolved into anything purposeful. They covered 4 blocks before Roman stopped, pulled out his phone, and called Reyes. The call rang 7 times. Nobody answered. Elena watched his face while the phone rang, and when he lowered it and looked at her, the flatness in his expression had taken on an edge she hadn't seen before. The particular quality of a man who is doing the rapid calculation of how bad a situation has become, while simultaneously recognizing that the calculation is going to come out worse than he wants it to. "Reyes always answers," he said. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that added anything. He tried Taro, 4 rings, voicemail. She thought about her father in an apartment above a dry cleaner in a neighborhood no one was supposed to know about, in a location that Harlan Cross knew about because Harlan Cross knew about everything Roman controlled, and she thought about the way her father had looked in the alley, the fine tremor in his arm, the red-rimmed eyes, the voice of a man running on empty after 20 years of carrying something alone. "We need to find him," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by that. "My father. Right now, before anything else." "Yes," Roman said, "and we're doing it without your infrastructure because your infrastructure has a hole in it that we can't see the full size of yet." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complicated and contained and not entirely readable. "Yes," he said again. She shifted the metal box under her arm. It was heavy and cold and contained, possibly, the evidence that could end this entire situation, and she was standing in a dark alley with a man whose organization had just been partially revealed as compromised, whose security chief was working for the person trying to destroy them both, whose safe locations were no longer safe, and she had no car, no support, no clear path forward, and her father was somewhere in this city in the hands of people who wanted the box she was carrying, and the night was not close to finished. She thought about her mother in the prep kitchen, hands moving fast and certain over the work in front of her, not looking up, just working. Elena Voss looked at Roman Calder in the dark alley and made a decision that had nothing to do with the marriage contract or the 48-hour clock or the transaction that had started all of this. A decision that came from somewhere older and less negotiable than any of that. And she said, "Tell me every location Cross doesn't know about." Roman looked at her. Then he started talking, and she listened with everything she had because the version of herself that had stood behind the restaurant counter 2 nights ago, wondering if she could manage this alone, was gone now, replaced by someone she was only beginning to recognize, someone who had been made in the last 40 hours out of information and fear, and the specific fury of a person who has finally understood the full shape of the thing being done to her and has decided that understanding is not the end of the road, but the beginning of a different one entirely. Roman knew 3 locations that Harlan Cross didn't. Not because he'd planned for betrayal specifically. He told her this without embellishment, walking fast through the alley while she kept pace, but because certain habits had accumulated over years of operating in environments where complete information sharing was itself a vulnerability. 3 places he'd established through channels Cross had never been part of. A storage unit in the Meridian district registered under a name that didn't connect to any Calder entity. A ground-floor office space in a building owned by a woman named Petra Van, who had owed Roman a debt of the non-financial kind for 6 years and who asked no questions. And a boat, moored at a private slip on the eastern waterfront, that existed in no document connected to his name or his organization. "The office," Elena said. "It's the only one with 4 walls and a door we can work behind." He nodded and made the call to Petra Van from a borrowed phone. He'd left his own in the car, which was now a liability parked on the side street behind a building that Victor's people were currently moving through. The borrowed phone belonged to a man who ran a late-night food cart 2 blocks from the alley, who had accepted $200 in cash from Roman with the blank-faced equanimity of someone who had learned that the city operated on layers and that the wisest approach was to engage only with the layer directly in front of you. Petra Van answered on the 3rd ring and said yes before Roman had finished explaining, which told Elena something about the nature of that debt. They moved. The office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow building that sold insurance products on the ground level, the kind of business that generated foot traffic at predictable hours and asked nothing of its upstairs neighbors. Petra Van was waiting at the side entrance. A woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up into silver hair and the direct, assessing eyes of someone who had been through enough to stop performing composure and simply have it. She handed Roman a key, looked at Elena for exactly 1 second with an expression that was not unfriendly but was very thorough, and then walked back to the main building without a word. Upstairs was a single room, desk, 2 chairs, a landline phone that looked like it hadn't been used in a decade, a window with the blinds drawn. Roman locked the door behind them, and Elena set the metal box on the desk, and they both stood there for a moment in the way people stand when they've been moving fast enough that stopping feels structurally wrong. "The combination," Elena said. Roman looked at the box. "I don't know it." She'd been afraid of that. She studied the lock, a 4-digit combination, standard fireproof box hardware, the kind of unit you could buy at any office supply store in the 90s. Her mother had bought it, set the combination, hidden the box, and then died. Her father hadn't known the combination. He'd known the location and nothing else. Elena sat down and put her hands flat on the box and thought about her mother. Catherine Aldrin Voss. A woman Elena had known for 7 years before losing her, which meant Elena's entire adult understanding of who her mother had been was constructed from fragments, photographs, her father's carefully selected memories, the shape of the absence itself. Her mother had been methodical. Her mother had been private. Her mother had been, Elena now understood, afraid in a way she'd hidden completely from everyone around her except perhaps Daniel Voss, and even him only partially. What combination does a methodical, private, frightened woman choose for a lock that has to stay locked for years but needs to be accessible to someone who might need it after she's gone? Not a birthday. Too obvious, and her mother would have known obvious was dangerous. Not a year. Same problem. Elena thought about the prep kitchen, her mother's hands on the steel table, the overturned stock pot she'd sat on as a child, the specific smell of that basement, cold and grease and something underneath both of those, something mineral, the smell of the old building. She thought about the address, Vetter Street, the original restaurant. Her parents had opened on a specific date. She knew it because her father told the story every anniversary, September 14th, 1987. He'd proposed to her mother in that kitchen 6 months later, February 28, 1988. Elena had been born. She stopped. She had been born in that building. Not in the building, but her mother had gone into labor during a dinner service, and her father had delivered her in the prep kitchen before the ambulance arrived. A story that had been told at every family gathering for as long as Elena could remember, always with the same details. March 3rd, 1989, 11:47 at night, under the fluorescent lights of the prep kitchen, And her father always said the same thing at the end of the story. She came into the world in the place we'd built, and your mother said that meant she'd always find her way back to it. Elena set the combination. 0303. March 3rd, the lock released. The Roman straightened from where he'd been leaning against the wall. Elena opened the box. Inside was a landscape of the past compressed into physical objects. USB drives in a sealed plastic bag, their labels handwritten in her mother's precise script. A bound ledger, old enough that the cover had softened with handling, filled with columns of numbers and names in ink that had faded to the brownish tone of old documents. A sealed envelope with Elena's name on it in her mother's handwriting, the letters slightly larger than the notations in the ledger, as if her mother had pressed harder when she wrote her daughter's name. Elena's hand moved toward the envelope and stopped. Not yet. The envelope was for later, for a moment when she had the space to receive whatever was inside it. Right now, the ledger was what mattered. She opened it, and Roman came to stand beside her, and they read together in the flat light of the office's single overhead fixture. The ledger was a transaction record spanning 3 years. Names, dates, account numbers, amounts. The names were not famous, most of them. They were the names of structures, LLCs, holding companies, the kind of entities that exist to put distance between a transaction and the person authorizing it. But interspersed among those were personal names, and as Elena moved through the pages, she recognized some of them. A city councilman who had been in office for 20 years, a real estate developer whose name appeared on 3 buildings she passed regularly, a man who had served 2 terms as the city's deputy comptroller, and then, on the 4th page from the back, a name she hadn't expected. She put her finger on it. Roman was already looking at it. Victor Emmanuel Sabel, 1994, 12 transactions, all moving money from an offshore structure through a domestic LLC into a real estate acquisition fund. He'd been 26 years old, and he had already been building the architecture that he was apparently still using 30 years later. "He's been at this since before your father's debt," Elena said. "Yes." Roman's voice was quiet and contained, but she could feel the tension in him, the particular stillness of a man processing a scope of betrayal that was still expanding. "The forgery's using my mother's signature," she said. "He knew about her documentation from the beginning, before he ever approached my father. He was positioning himself near our family from the start, because he believed we were the path to these records. And we gave him direct access by financing your father's project," Roman said. "7 years ago, I personally connected Victor to your family because I trusted his judgment about where to extend resources." He paused. "I handed him the proximity he needed." She looked at him. "You didn't know," she said. "Not as absolution, just as a fact." "That's not particularly comforting from where I'm standing," he said. She understood that and didn't argue with it. She took photographs of every page of the ledger with the borrowed phone, then the USB drives. Then she sealed everything back inside the box and locked it. Her father, Reyes, Taro. 3 people in a location that was no longer safe, and they had been there for, she checked the time, 41 minutes. She looked at Roman. "We need to move on the apartment," she said, "right now. We don't know what we're walking into." "I know, we're going anyway." He looked at her for a moment, and something passed through his expression that was too fast to name. Then he picked up the landline and made 3 calls she wasn't meant to follow, and when he set it down, he said, "I have 2 people who are off the grid tonight. Not part of my regular operations, not known to cross. They can meet us in 15 minutes. "Who are they?" "People who owe me," he said. "The same category as Petra Van." "You collect a lot of those." "It's the only currency that doesn't lose value," he said, and picked up the borrowed phone. "What?" The 2 people were a man and a woman, both somewhere in their 40s, who arrived in a van with commercial signage on the side that had nothing to do with whatever they actually were. The man's name was Cole. The woman didn't offer one. They accepted the situation briefing from Roman with the focused efficiency of people who absorbed information quickly and operationalized it without requiring additional context. They drove to the apartment building in 2 vehicles, approaching from different blocks. Elena rode with Roman and held the metal box in her lap with both hands and watched the streets move past and made herself think tactically rather than emotionally, which was a discipline she hadn't known she possessed until the last 48 hours had required it of her continuously. Her father was 63 years old, and had a heart condition he managed with medication he would have left at the house in the evacuation. She needed to know that before she knew anything else. They parked and converged on the building from two sides. The entrance was unlocked. Not forced, not damaged, just unlocked, which was wrong. The front door of an apartment building at 2 in the morning should require a code. This one swung open freely, which meant someone had already been through it. Roman's hand was at her arm. Not restraining, warning. She acknowledged it and kept moving. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. They took the stairs, all 4 of them, moving with the specific quiet that the situation demanded. Elena's heart was doing something percussive against her ribs that she was choosing to ignore. The stairwell smelled of cooking from 2 floors below, an old carpet, and the specific sealed-in atmosphere of a building that held its heat, 3rd floor landing. The apartment was at the end of the hall. The door was open. 3 inches, maybe 4. Enough to see the light inside, enough to hear. Nothing. No voices, no movement. Roman went through first, low and fast, and Elena was right behind him. And the woman with no name was behind her. And Cole took the doorframe, and what they found inside was Reyes, sitting against the far wall with her hands zip-tied behind her and a cut above her left eyebrow that had bled down her cheek and dried there. Taro, unconscious on the floor beside her but breathing. Elena could see his chest moving. Her father was not in the room. Reyes looked up when they came in, and her eyes found Roman, and she said, with the controlled precision of someone working through pain to convey accurate information. 6 minutes ago, Cross took him. He has a car. He said to tell you... She paused, working through something. He said to tell you Victor is ready to negotiate. He has your father, and he wants the box. The silence in the room lasted about 2 seconds. Then Elena said, "Where?" Reyes looked at her. "The waterfront building. The Calder property on Pier 11. Cross said an hour." 1 hour. Elena looked at Roman. His face was doing something complex and contained. He was looking at Reyes with the expression of a man cataloging damage he feels responsible for. And he was also clearly doing the tactical calculus of the situation simultaneously, and she could see both things happening at once in the set of his jaw, the steadiness of his breathing. "Let me out," Reyes said. "I'm going with you." "You have a head injury," Roman said. "I know what I have," Reyes said. "Let me out." Elena found a knife in the kitchen and cut the zip tie herself. They worked fast. Taro was coming around, a concussion, almost certainly, but responsive and tracking when Roman crouched in front of him and asked his name and the date. The woman with no name stayed with him. Cole took a position in the building's lobby. Roman and Elena and Reyes took the van. 22 minutes to the waterfront. Elena sat in the back with the box and the borrowed phone and used the ride to think about everything she knew about Pier 11, which was not much. Commercial wharf space, the kind of building that had been a warehouse in its previous life and had been acquired by a Calder subsidiary 4 years ago. Large interior. Multiple access points. Water on one side. "Victor will have people inside," Reyes said from the front passenger seat, pressing her sleeve against the cut on her forehead. "Cross knows our playbook. He'll have anticipated every approach we know how to make." "Then we make one he doesn't know," Elena said. Reyes turned and looked at her in the dark of the van. "You have something in mind," Roman said. He wasn't asking. "Victor wants this box," Elena said. "That's the entire play tonight. Everything he's done for months has been aimed at getting what's in this box, which means as long as I have it, I have a position." She looked at the metal surface in her lap. "He wants to negotiate. Fine, I'll negotiate. I walk in, I talk to him, and I buy you enough time to come in the way he's not expecting." "He'll search you," Reyes said. "Yes." Elena thought about the ledger photographs on the borrowed phone. "Let him. If something goes wrong while you're in there, then something goes wrong." She kept her voice level. "My father is in that building. There's no version of this where I stay outside and wait." Roman didn't argue with her. She'd noticed he did that. He absorbed her decisions with the seriousness of someone who recognized that her judgment had earned a certain weight over the last 48 hours, and he adjusted his planning around them rather than trying to overwrite them. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she filed it away with the other things she was filing away for later. They parked 3 blocks from the pier. Reyes had a backup phone in her jacket that Cross hadn't found, and she and Roman coordinated a 4-minute window. Elena goes in, makes contact, buys time, and at the 4-minute mark, Roman and Reyes come through the building's service access on the water side, while Cole, reached by Reyes's phone, brings 2 more people through the street entrance. 4 minutes was not a lot of time. It was what they had. Elena got out of the van. Roman got out behind her, and she turned, and he was standing there in the cold waterfront air with the lights of the pier behind him. And he said quietly, without any of the careful management she'd watched him apply to his words for 2 days, "If you feel like the situation is changing in there, don't wait for the 4 minutes. Get out." She looked at him. "I'll be fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you anyway." She took the box and walked toward the pier. Bang. Pier 11's main entrance was a steel door that was standing open, which was not a good sign and also completely expected. The man outside it didn't try to stop her. He stepped aside and gestured her through with the particular blankness of someone executing instructions precisely. He took the box from her hands and she let him take it, and he patted her down efficiently and professionally and found the borrowed phone, which he pocketed, and then he led her inside. The interior of the building was cavernous. The old warehouse configuration, high ceiling, the structural bones of the loading operation that had once run here still visible in the overhead rigging and the raised floor sections near the water access doors. It was lit with work lights strung along the ceiling, bright enough to eliminate shadows without creating warmth, the kind of light that flattened everything and made distances hard to judge. Her father was sitting in a chair near the center of the space. He was upright, which she took as information, conscious, not visibly hurt, though the distance between them was too great to read his face. There were 4 men positioned around the perimeter of the space that she could see, and at least 1 more near the water doors that she couldn't fully locate. Victor Sable was standing 20 feet from her father. She had built a mental image of him from the fragments she'd collected. The forged documents, the financial structures, the 30-year history laid out in her mother's ledger. And the man in front of her matched and didn't match it simultaneously. I was in his late 50s, compact in build, with the kind of face that was not memorable by design, eyes that were pale and precise, and currently aimed at her with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment for a long time. He smiled when he saw her. The smile was not cruel. That was the thing that unsettled her most. It was almost warm. "Elena Voss," he said, "you look like your mother." She kept walking until she was 15 feet from him and stopped. "Where's Cross?" Victor glanced to his left, and Harlan Cross stepped out of the shadows near the water doors. Tall, mid-40s, with the look of a man who was very good at being trusted. He met Elena's eyes without visible discomfort. People who operated at that level of betrayal generally didn't have the luxury of visible discomfort. "The box," Victor said, and one of his men set it on a crate between them. "It's locked," Elena said. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "You opened it already, in the office on Caldwell." She filed that away. They'd had eyes on that building too. "Then you know what's inside." "I know what your mother compiled," he said. "What I need to know is whether she compiled all of it or whether there are elements that exist separately." He paused. There were 2 people who knew the full scope of what that network was doing. Your mother was one. The other has been dead for 15 years. What I need to understand is whether she had access to his material as well, or only her own. Elena looked at him. "You've been looking for this for 30 years, she said. "You're not sure what's in there." "I'm sure of most of it," he said. "The uncertainty is what brings us here tonight." She thought about the USB drives, the labeled handwriting, her mother's precise, private documentation. "I haven't looked at the drives," she said. "The ledger was enough to understand the scope. The drives might have what you're describing, or they might not." "Then we open the box together," Victor said. "Give me the combination." She held his gaze. "My father first," she said. Victor tilted his head slightly. "Your father is on his feet, walking toward me. Before I give you anything." Victor looked at her for a moment with the patient attention of a man recalculating, and then he nodded to the man nearest Daniel Voss, and the man stepped back, and her father stood from the chair with the careful movement of someone whose joints had gone stiff from sitting under stress, and walked toward her with the slow, deliberate gait of a man making absolutely sure he doesn't stumble. He reached her, and she put her hand on his arm, and he covered her hand with his, and she felt his pulse against her fingers, fast but steady. She looked at Victor. 0303, she said. Victor's man set the combination and opened the box, and Victor crossed to it and looked inside, and she watched him look at the ledger, the USB drives, the sealed envelope. He picked up the envelope, read her name on it, and set it back down. He picked up one of the USB drives and held it in his palm and looked at it with an expression she hadn't expected to see on his face, something like relief. He turned to Cross. "It's here." Cross nodded. Victor looked at Elena. "I want you to understand something," he said. "What your mother did, keeping these records, hiding them, was an act of extraordinary courage. I respected her for it then. I still do." He set the drive back in the box. "But what she documented also implicates people who have built 30 years of legitimate work on the foundation of that period. Exposing it destroys institutions that function, that provide things this city needs. The cost of the truth is higher than you understand." Elena looked at him. "That's what people say," she said, "when they don't want to pay the cost themselves." The warmth left Victor's face, not replaced by anger, replaced by something more like finality, the expression of a man closing a door he'd hoped might stay open. He looked at Cross. Cross reached into his jacket, and then every light in the building went out simultaneously. In the dark, Elena grabbed her father's arm and dropped low and moved, not toward the entrance, toward the water doors, because Roman had said 4 minutes, and it had been 4 minutes, and the water side was where he was coming from. And she moved in the dark with her father's weight against her side and the metal box somewhere behind her in the hands of a man she couldn't see, toward the sound of the water, toward whatever was coming through that door, because forward was the only direction that had ever gotten her anywhere in the last 48 hours, and she was not about to stop now. The water doors burst open with a sound like a percussion strike, and cold air and light flooded in, and Elena pulled her father down behind a metal support pillar and looked back across the space at the chaos that was reshaping itself in the beams of flashlights and the blue-white of the water's reflected light, and she found Victor in the confusion, still standing, still composed, still holding in one hand the USB drive he hadn't set back in the box. And she saw the precise moment he understood that the situation had changed in a way he had not fully modeled, that Roman Calder was in the building, that Reyes was 3 feet behind him, that the 4 men on the perimeter were now occupied with people coming through 2 separate entrances, and that the particular patient certainty that had carried Victor Sable through 30 years of careful operation had just encountered something it hadn't adequately accounted for. Victor looked across the chaos and found Elena's eyes in the dark. He still had the drive. He turned and walked toward the far end of the building with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has operated long enough to know that running is what draws fire. And Elena pushed her father further behind the pillar and looked for Roman in the fractured light, and found him 15 feet away, moving through the space with 2 of his people, cutting off the perimeter positions. And she made a decision in the half-second of recognition that she had exactly 1 move available to her that no one else in this building could make. She went after Victor herself. Her father's voice came sharp behind her. "Elena!" She was already moving. Victor was heading for a side door she hadn't clocked on entry, a maintenance access in the far wall that was barely visible in the current light conditions, and he moved like a man who had studied the layout of this building carefully, and she moved like a woman who had spent 2 days being underestimated by everyone in the room and was done with it, and she crossed the space in a flat run, dodging a crate, going low under a rigging cable, closing the distance as Victor hit the door and pushed through it, and she hit it 4 seconds behind him and followed him through into a narrow service corridor that ran along the building's exterior and ended in a metal stairwell going up. She could hear him on the stairs above her. She went up. The stairwell opened onto the building's roof, and the roof was the waterfront in the dark. The city lights on one side, the black movement of water on the other, the wind coming off the harbor with enough force to push against her when she came through the door. And Victor was 20 feet away, moving toward the far edge of the roof, the USB drive still in his hand, and she ran. He heard her coming and turned, and the expression on his face when he saw her. Not one of his people, not Roman, but Elena Voss in sweatpants and a jacket with her hair coming out of its pins and her hands empty, was the first fully unguarded expression she had seen from him. He hadn't expected her. "Give me the drive," she said. She was breathing hard. She didn't try to hide it. He looked at her across 20 feet of rooftop with the wind pulling at both of them, and he held the drive up between his fingers, and the city lights caught the small rectangular edge of it, and he said, "You understand what happens when this becomes public?" "Yes," she said. 30 years of careers, institutions, people who stopped doing what they did in that ledger a long time ago. "And people who didn't," she said. "And you." "And me," he agreed. He looked at the drive. "Your mother wanted to use this to build something better. She told me that once. In a different time. She believed information could be surgical, that you could expose the rot without destroying the structure around it." "Did you believe her?" He looked up. "I believe she was naive," he said. "I still do." He drew back his arm. He was going to throw it into the harbor. Elena moved before she thought about moving, closing the 20 feet in the time it took Victor's arm to reach full extension, and she caught his wrist with both hands, and her weight hit him sideways and they went down together on the roof surface, hard, her knees hitting concrete and his shoulder taking the impact of the fall, and his hand opened with the shock of the impact, and the drive skittered across the roof surface and stopped against the low parapet at the roof's edge. She got there first. She picked it up. She stood and turned, breathing in ragged pulls, knees burning, and Victor was on the ground behind her getting to one knee, and behind him the rooftop door opened and Roman came through it. He looked at Elena, he looked at Victor, he looked at the drive in Elena's hand. Below them, through the roof, the sounds of the confrontation in the building were shifting, not escalating, resolving. She could hear it in the change of acoustics, the decrease in movement, the absence of the particular urgency that active struggle produces. Victor got fully to his feet. He looked at Roman with the expression of a man who has reached the far end of something and is doing the accounting of what the journey cost. He looked at Elena with something she could not fully name, not defeat, not anger, something more like a very old exhaustion that had finally found the moment to show itself. "It's over, Victor," Roman said. Victor straightened his jacket. He looked at the drive in Elena's hand one more time. Then he looked at Roman and said, with complete evenness, "You won't execute me. It's not who you are anymore. Which means there's still a path out of this that doesn't end the way you think it does." Roman looked at him. "You're right," he said. "I'm not going to execute you." Something shifted in Victor's expression. "I'm going to do something you never planned for," Roman said, and he reached into his jacket and produced a phone and held it up so Victor could see the screen. Elena looked. The screen showed a live connection to a federal number. The call had been running for 11 minutes. Everything on that rooftop, every word, every admission, every 30-year history that Victor had laid out in the conversation below and the minutes since had been transmitted in real time to people who were, even now, almost certainly already moving. Victor looked at the phone. For the first time in 2 days of watching him, Elena saw something that might have been fear cross his face, and she understood in that moment that a man like Victor Sable was not afraid of violence, was not afraid of confrontation, was not afraid of the kinds of force that Roman's world normally applied. But what he was afraid of was exactly this: the legitimate machinery, the public record, the kind of exposure you couldn't negotiate or disappear or manage from the inside. He took one step toward Roman. Reyes came through the rooftop door behind Roman and stopped with her hand at her side, and Victor looked at her and stopped. He stood on the rooftop with the harbor dark behind him and the city lit in front of him and 30 years of architecture crumbling in the 11 minutes of a phone call. And Elena stood 10 feet away holding the drive that contained the evidence that had been hidden in the floor of a prep kitchen for 20 years. And her hands were not shaking, and her knees were bleeding through her jeans, and she was thinking, underneath all of it, in the part of her that was already moving past the moment toward whatever came next, about a sealed envelope in a metal box in her mother's handwriting, her name on the front, pressed harder than the rest. Her father was in the building below. Reyes was on the roof. The call was running. The evidence was in her hand. Victor Sable was standing against the parapet, with the look of a man doing the arithmetic of a situation that had definitively stopped adding up in his favor. And Roman Calder was looking at her with an expression she had no framework for yet, complicated and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before, as if the last 11 minutes had used up whatever reserve of careful management he'd been operating from, and what was left underneath it was something he hadn't decided yet what to do with. The wind came off the harbor and pulled at all of them, and none of them moved, and below the roof the city made its continuous indifferent sound, and Elena Voss stood on a pier rooftop at 3 in the morning holding a USB drive that her mother had hidden 20 years ago for exactly this moment, and she waited for whatever happened next. Victor Sable did not run. That was the thing Elena would think about afterward, in the weeks when the nights were still long enough to replay it. That he simply stood there on the rooftop with the harbor behind him and the federal call running on Roman's phone and looked at the situation with the same composed attention he had apparently brought to every moment of the last 30 years. And he made the calculation, and the calculation came out the way it came out, and he accepted it. Not gracefully. Not with any performance of dignity. He just stopped moving in the direction of resistance, the way a machine stops when the power is cut, and stood there with the wind off the harbor pulling at his jacket and his hands loose at his sides. Reyes crossed the rooftop and secured his wrists with the same zip ties that had been used on her 40 minutes earlier, which was either irony or efficiency, and probably both. Roman kept the phone active. He spoke into it for 3 minutes, giving information Elena couldn't fully follow. Coordinates, names, reference numbers that meant something to the person on the other end. The compressed language of a conversation that had clearly been prepared for, structured, which told her that this moment, this specific rooftop, this specific night, had not been improvised on Roman's end. He had arranged the federal connection before they'd driven to the pier. He had walked into that building with the call already waiting to be opened. She looked at him when he ended the call. He looked back and said nothing. She was not ready to have that conversation yet. She turned and went back through the rooftop door. Her father was in the main warehouse space, sitting on the same chair they'd kept him in, but now the chair was facing the open water doors, and the harbor air was coming through, and he was holding a paper cup of something warm that one of Roman's people had apparently produced from somewhere, and he looked up when Elena came down the stairs, and the expression on his face when he saw her. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying dread so long that its absence feels like something physical, was almost more than she could process in the current state of her capacity. She crossed the warehouse floor and sat on a crate beside him, and he put his free hand on her arm, and she let him. "You're bleeding," he said, looking at her knees. "I know. Are you all right?" "Yes." She thought about it. "Mostly." He nodded and looked at the harbor. They sat like that for a moment in the noise of the situation winding down around them. Roman's people moving through the space, Rhea's organizing something near the entrance, Cross being kept in a corner by a man Elena didn't know. "She left me a letter," Elena said. Her father's hand tightened slightly on her arm. "I know." "You knew about the letter." "She told me she'd written one. She didn't tell me what was in it." He looked at the harbor. "I always assumed it was for a different version of things, that you'd find it someday when it didn't, when things weren't like this." Elena thought about the sealed envelope in the metal box, which was somewhere in the warehouse, and she thought about the combination she'd entered, her own birthday, the date her mother had gone into labor in the prep kitchen of the Vetter Street restaurant, and she thought about a woman who had been afraid for 11 years and had spent that fear carefully, constructively, building something that would outlast her if it had to. "She knew this might happen," Elena said. "That's why she set it up the way she did. She knew someone might come looking. She knew the documentation would need to survive." "Yes," her father said. "She didn't tell you where it was because she was protecting you. If you didn't know, you couldn't be pressured into revealing it." "Yes." "And you've known that for 20 years. He was quiet for a moment. "She was the most deliberate person I ever met," he said. "Everything she did had a reason. Even the things that looked like ordinary life, the way she ran the kitchen, the way she filed things, the way she taught you to work." He paused. "She was always thinking about the version of things where she wasn't there." Elena looked at the harbor and felt something move through her chest that was large and complicated and not yet fully available to her. The kind of grief that shows up late because it waited for a moment when you could afford it. "She was thinking about me," Elena said. "She was always thinking about you," her father said. They sat there while the warehouse finished settling into something like aftermath. Harlan Cross was taken by federal agents 40 minutes later, along with 2 of Victor's men who had stayed in the building. The agents arrived in the efficient, organized way of people who have been briefed thoroughly, which told Elena that Roman's preparation for this night had extended further back than she'd understood. She watched the process from near the water doors, the metal box in her hands, and when the lead agent, a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Farrell and shook Elena's hand with the directness of someone who dispensed with social formality on principle, asked for the documentation, Elena handed over the ledger and two of the USB drives and kept the third, which contained something she'd seen labeled in her mother's handwriting as personal, E, and which she was not yet ready to submit to any process. Agent Farrell looked at her. "The retained drive," she said. "Is personal correspondence," Elena said, "not operational records." Farrell held her gaze for a moment. "We'll need to verify that." "I'll make it available when I've reviewed it," Elena said. "It belonged to my mother. She's been dead for 11 years. Give me a week." Another moment. Then Farrell nodded. Victor Sable was brought down from the roof by Reyes and a federal agent, and he walked through the warehouse with his hands secured and his face in the same composed arrangement it had been in all night, and when he passed Elena, he stopped. The agent behind him allowed it, briefly. And he looked at her and said, "The ledger will cost people more than you intend." "I know," she said. He studied her. "And you're doing it anyway." "My mother did it anyway," she said. "She just ran out of time." Something moved across Victor Sable's face that was not the warmth from earlier and was not the cold precision of the operational man. It was something older and less categorizable, and it was gone in a second, and he walked out of the warehouse in the custody of a federal agent without saying anything further. Elena watched him go. She stood there until the sound of the cars outside disappeared and the warehouse was quiet except for Roman's people and her father and the water at the dock. And then she exhaled slowly, all the way out, and found that the air at the bottom of the exhale was steadier than she'd expected. Roman found her sitting on the dock edge with her feet hanging over the water, the metal box beside her, the sealed envelope in her hands. She hadn't opened it yet. She'd been sitting there for 10 minutes working up to it, which was longer than anything in the last 48 hours had required of her, and she was aware of the irony of that. The rooftop had been fine. The coal chute had been fine. The warehouse and the men and the 48-hour clock had all been manageable, and a sealed envelope from her dead mother was the thing that was taking her 10 minutes. Roman sat down beside her, not close, leaving a foot of space between them, and looked at the water. "The federal contact," she said after a moment. "How long had that been arranged?" 6 weeks, he said, "before the contract, before I came to the restaurant." He kept his gaze on the water. "When I understood the scope of what Victor was doing, I started building an exit from the situation that didn't end with a body. It took time to identify someone in federal law enforcement who wasn't already inside the network your mother documented." "Farrell," she said. "Farrell came up clean. She'd been investigating the financial structures in that ledger from the outside for 3 years without a way in." He paused. "The documentation your mother compiled is what she needed. It was always what she needed." Elena looked at the envelope. "You could have told me that from the beginning. If I'd told you from the beginning, you would have made different decisions. Gone to Farrell directly, without the cover of the marriage contract, without the legal protection of the Calder name around your family while the situation resolved." He glanced at her. Victor would have moved faster and had less to manage around. "That's a justification, not a reason." "It's both," he said. She didn't argue with it. She turned the envelope over in her hands. Her name in her mother's script. The letters pressed deep into the paper. "Were you ever going to tell me about the federal arrangement?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Tonight, before we went to the pier." "You didn't." "There wasn't time." He looked at the water. "And I wanted to tell you in a moment when you could absorb it rather than just add it to the stack." She looked at the side of his face. "You've been managing the situation since you walked into my restaurant," she said. "Yes." "And managing me." He turned and met her eyes. "I managed the circumstances around you. I didn't manage you. Nobody managed you. I watched you find things in 48 hours that I'd spent 6 months trying to locate, make decisions under pressure that people with 20 years of experience in this world wouldn't have made as cleanly, and hold together a situation that was designed specifically to break people." He held her gaze without flinching and without any performance of warmth, just the flat honesty of a man saying a thing because it is accurate. "I managed the circumstances. You managed yourself." She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then looked back at the water. "The marriage contract," she said. "What happens to it?" "Whatever you decide," he said. That was always the answer, whether I communicated it clearly or not. She looked at the envelope. She opened it. Her mother's handwriting inside was smaller than on the envelope, more compressed, the writing of someone fitting a great deal into a space she'd measured carefully. The paper was the kind of good stationery that held ink without bleeding, cream-colored, slightly textured, the kind you kept for things that mattered. Elena read it straight through without stopping. She didn't read it aloud. Roman didn't ask her to. Her mother had written about the network, briefly. A summary Elena now knew matched the ledger, confirmation that the documentation was complete and intentional and had been arranged to be found by the right person at the right time. She had written about Victor Sable with the specific clarity of someone who had known him when he was a different person, or a person she'd believed was different, and who had processed the betrayal thoroughly enough to describe it without heat. She had written about Roman's father in 2 sentences that were warmer than anything else in the letter, the kind of warmth that comes from genuine gratitude for a specific, unrepeatable act. And then she had written about Elena. Not instructions, not warnings, not the organized practical information that governed the first half of the letter. Just Elena. The child she'd had in the prep kitchen of a restaurant she'd built with her hands. The person she'd watched become a person across 7 years before she'd run out of time to keep watching. She wrote, "I don't know what you'll be when you read this, but I know what you were when I knew you, and what you were was someone who understood that the right thing and the safe thing are almost never the same thing, and who did the right thing anyway, every time, even when you were 6 years old and it cost you something. That doesn't change. That's in you the way the bones are in you. It was there when you were born, and it'll be there when you're old, and I'm sorry I won't be there to see all the versions of it." She wrote, "Don't be afraid of the complicated ones. The people who are easy because they've never been tested. The ones worth knowing are the ones who've been through something and came out still trying to be decent. They're harder to find and harder to trust, but they're the ones who stay." She wrote, "I hid this because I was afraid. I want you to know that. I was afraid for a long time and I hid things because of it, and I'm sorry for what that fear cost you and your father. I hope the cost was worth what's in the box. I believe it was. I hope you do too." The letter ended there. No formal closing. Just her signature, the full name Elena had known all her life. The same one on the letterhead of the restaurant that had been registered in her mother's name before it became the family business. Catherine Aldrin Voss. Elena sat on the dock with the letter in her hands and the water moving below her, and Roman called her 3 feet to her right, and she breathed through it, all of it, the 20 years and the 48 hours, and the prep kitchen, and the sealed box, and the rooftop, and the photograph taken 18 months ago by people paid to watch a woman who didn't know she was being watched. And she let it move through her the way you let cold water move through your hands, not trying to hold it, not trying to stop it, just letting it pass. When she was done, she folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. "She was right," Elena said. Roman waited. "About all of it," she said. "The documentation, the arrangement, leaving it where she left it." She looked at the water. She was right that it would find its moment. She just didn't know how long the moment would take. 20 years, Roman said. "She would have hated that," Elena said. "She was not a patient person." She paused. "That's where I get it from." Something shifted in Roman's expression. Not a smile, but the movement that occurs near a smile in someone who has largely forgotten how to produce one unselfconsciously. She looked at him. "The people in the ledger," she said. "The ones still operating. What happens?" Farrell's investigation moves forward. Some of them have built enough legitimate work on top of the original structure that the exposure will be selective. Others won't be able to separate themselves from what's documented. He paused. "It's not surgical. It's not clean. Some innocent people will be caught in the margins of it. But it moves forward." "Yes," she nodded. "And your organization." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he'd been sitting with the question already. "There are elements of it that don't survive this," he said. "Not because of prosecution. The legitimate holdings are clean. But the architecture that supported the other operations depends on the network of obligations and fear that Victor helped build over 11 years. When that network understands that Victor is finished and that I cooperated with federal investigators, the nature of what I've been operating changes fundamentally." "Is that a loss?" she said. He looked at the water for a long moment. Some of it is, he said. Some of it is not. She believed him. Tet. They drove her father home as the city was beginning to produce its earliest gray light, the hour just before the sky commits to morning, when the streets belong to delivery trucks and insomniacs and people coming off night shifts who walk with the particular inward focus of those moving through a world that isn't fully awake yet. Her father sat in the back seat and said almost nothing, and Elena watched him from the front and thought about 20 years of a secret carried alone and what it looked like when you finally set it down. Not relief, exactly, more like the confusion of hands that have been clenched so long they don't immediately know what to do with the open position. Roman stopped the car in front of the house. The street was ordinary in the gray light. Trees, parked cars, the neighbor's porch light still on from last night. Everything unchanged. Her father got out slowly, and Elena got out with him, and she walked him to the door and waited while he found his keys. And when he had the door open, he turned and looked at her in the early light with the expression of a man who has a great many things to say and has identified none of them as adequate. "Go to sleep," she said. "We'll talk tomorrow." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "Ask me in a week," she said. "Right now I'm still just moving." He put his hand against the side of her face for a moment. The specific touch of a parent, the kind that carries everything that doesn't have words. And then he went inside and she heard the lock turn, and she stood on the porch in the early light until she was sure the sound of his movement through the house had settled into the sound of a person finding somewhere to stop. Then she turned and went back to the car. Roman was standing outside it, leaning against the driver's side with his arms crossed and his jacket collar up against the early morning cold, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has been awake for a very long time and is no longer fighting it. She stopped in front of him. "Harlan Cross," she said. "How long do you think he was working for Victor?" "At least 3 years," Roman said. "Probably more." Reyes found 3 months of communication between them in a second phone she pulled from his jacket. He paused. "I'm responsible for that. I brought Cross in. I trusted him with everything." "You trusted a lot of people who turned out to be something else," she said. "Yes." "That's not stupidity," she said. "That's what it costs to build something that requires trust to function. You pay for it sometimes." He looked at her. "That's a generous way to frame it," he said. "It's an accurate one," she said. "I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate." She looked at the gray street. "The marriage contract. I want to be clear about something." He waited. "I understand why you structured things the way you did. I understand the legal protection, the timing, the logic of it. I'm not interested in relitigating the decisions you made under the circumstances you made them in. But I need you to understand that going forward, any arrangement between us, any arrangement at all, is between us. Not managed, not structured around what's useful to someone's operational situation. Actual terms, agreed on by 2 people. He held her gaze. "I understand that." "Do you?" "Yes," he said. And the simplicity of it, the lack of qualification, landed differently than she'd expected. She looked at him in the early gray light. This man who had walked into her restaurant in the rain and placed a document on her counter and told her she had 48 hours, who had turned out to be something considerably more complicated than that entrance suggested, who was in the process of dismantling something he'd spent his adult life building because the structure of it had become incompatible with the direction he was apparently choosing instead. She didn't entirely understand him yet. She thought that was probably the most honest thing she could say about it. "I'm going to need to sleep for approximately 3 days, she said. "Yes," he said. "And then I'm going to need to deal with the restaurant license renewal that's been pending for 6 weeks, and the 42 employees who haven't been paid since the accounts were frozen, and the suppliers who need to be called, and my father who needs to actually explain to me the full extent of every secret he's been keeping, not the partial version. All of that can happen," he said. "I know it can happen," she said. "I'm listing it because I want you to understand what my life actually is. Not the situation, the actual life." He nodded. "I understand." She looked at him a moment longer. "Go home, Roman," she said. "Deal with the things you need to deal with. I'll call you." Something moved in his expression that she was beginning to be able to read. Not happiness, which would have been out of place, but something that functioned the way relief functions in someone who has learned to keep it small. "All right," he said. She turned and walked down the street in the direction of the apartment she hadn't slept in since midnight 2 days ago. The metal box under her arm, the letter in her jacket pocket, the borrowed phone dead in her hand. The city was beginning to wake around her. The first deliveries, the first commuters, the first thin light making the buildings visible without yet making them warm. She did not look back. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early spring, when the light was doing something particular to the windows of the Vetter Street building, Elena stood in the prep kitchen of the original restaurant and looked at the floor where the tile had been replaced. It was seamless. She'd done it herself, 2 days after everything ended, with tile adhesive and grout she'd bought at a hardware store and her father's instruction over the phone because his knees didn't permit him to kneel on concrete anymore. The seam was invisible unless you knew where to look. She'd come here this morning for no specific reason, or for the reason that didn't have a name yet. The one that brought you back to particular places after particular events, needing to stand in the location where something happened in order to understand that it was over. She stood there a while. She thought about her mother in this room, the speed of her hands, the way she moved around the steel table with the automatic knowledge of a person who had made the same movements 10,000 times. She thought about being 6 years old on an overturned stockpot, watching that movement with the uncritical absorption of a child who assumes the people she loves are simply the way people are. She thought about what her mother had been carrying in this room, the fear, the documentation, the specific loneliness of protecting people from knowledge they hadn't been given the choice to bear. She thought, I would have helped you. She stood there with that for a while. Then she went upstairs. The license renewal had come through 12 days after the federal investigation became public, with a speed that suggested someone had removed an obstruction rather than processed an application. The accounts had been unfrozen within 36 hours of Victor Sable's arrest, with the bank manager leaving a voicemail for Elena that she had not returned and did not plan to. The suppliers came back, most of them. 2 did not, and she found replacements, which was time-consuming and expensive and entirely manageable. The 42 employees were paid retroactively, with a letter from Elena that said nothing about what had happened and everything about the fact that their jobs were secure and that the family appreciated their patience. She wrote it herself in the back office at 11 at night, alone. With bad coffee and a draft, she rewrote 4 times because the first 3 sounded like the corporate correspondence she had always disliked on principle. Her father talked to her for 3 hours on a Wednesday afternoon in the restaurant kitchen while the early prep was happening around them. He told her everything he'd omitted across the years. Not defensively, not with the performance of contrition, but with the flat honesty of a man who has decided that the era of protective withholding is finished. He told her about the loan and the full terms of it. He told her about the intermediary he'd contacted 18 months ago when he'd started to sense movement around the family. He told her about the 2 times in the last decade when he'd come close to telling her the truth and had decided each time that the cost of her knowing outweighed the benefit. She listened to all of it. She did not tell him he'd been right. She did not tell him he'd been wrong. She told him that going forward she preferred complete information to managed partial information, that she understood his reasoning without agreeing with it, and that she needed time before she could locate where the conversation about trust sat in relation to all the things he had done out of what she knew was genuine love. He looked at her with the eyes of a man receiving the most careful and honest response he'd ever gotten from his daughter and said, "That's fair." She nodded and went back to work. Assad. Roman called on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after everything ended. Not to manage anything, not with information. He called and asked if she wanted to have coffee, and the directness of the question was so different from the 48-hour ultimatum and the corporate folders and the marriage contract that had started all of this, that she held the phone for a moment and almost laughed. She said yes. They met at a place she chose, a diner 2 blocks from the original restaurant that had been operating since the 70s, and that she'd been going to her entire life, and that had nothing to do with him or his world or any arrangement between them. She got there first and ordered coffee and was halfway through it when he arrived, and he sat down across from her in the particular way of someone who is accustomed to having significant space and is choosing not to claim it. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Not about Victor. Not about the federal investigation, which was ongoing and which Farrell updated her on in periodic emails that Elena read carefully and acknowledged briefly. Not about the marriage contract or the 48-hour clock or any of the machinery that had brought them into contact in the first place. They talked about the restaurant, about her father's health, which was being managed carefully now that the stress of 20 years of secrecy had been discharged, about the early spring light and what it did to the city, about a book he was reading, which surprised her, not that he read, but that he mentioned it without self-consciousness, about a decision she was making regarding the Vetter Street building, whether to reopen it as a second location or to let it stay as it was, the original space, the one that had mattered to her mother, the one with the replaced tile in the prep kitchen basement. He didn't give her an opinion on that question. She noticed and appreciated it. When they stood to leave, he held the door and she went through it, and they stood on the sidewalk in the spring light for a moment. "The building," she said. "I'm going to open it again." He looked at her. "Not as an expansion," she said, "as its own thing. The original menu, the way my parents ran it in the beginning. There are people in this city who remember it, and I think some things are worth maintaining." She paused. "My mother worked in that kitchen for 18 years. I'm not leaving it closed." Roman nodded. "That's right," he said simply. She looked at him in the spring light and thought about what her mother had written. The ones worth knowing are the ones who've been through something and came out still trying to be decent. And she thought about 30 years of a man's history and one night on a rooftop and the federal call that had been running for 11 minutes and the specific, unmistakable quality of a person choosing differently than they have been choosing, at significant personal cost, because something in them has reached the end of a certain road and found that the next one has to go a different direction. She wasn't certain of him. She thought that was the honest position. She also wasn't finished. "Call me Thursday," she said. "There's a thing with the new suppliers I want a second opinion on that has nothing to do with anything you've been involved in before." He looked at her. "All right," he said. She walked toward the restaurant. A month later, on a morning that was close enough to real spring that you could stop arguing about it, Elena unlocked the front door of the Vetter Street building for the first time since she'd relocked it after everything ended. The dining room was still the dining room, the chairs still stacked on the tables, the geometry of the room unchanged, the windows carrying the same light they'd always carried, the particular quality of that light on the floor, exactly as she remembered it from childhood, when her mother brought her here before service started and let her sit at the table nearest the window and do her homework while the kitchen got ready. She set her bag down and started pulling chairs off tables. She worked alone for the first hour. She didn't play music, she just worked, moving through the room with the systematic progress of someone who knows the space from the inside, knows where the floor is uneven near the south wall, knows which table has the leg that needs to be checked before anyone sits down on the east side, knows that the window in the back catches afternoon light in a way that makes the whole room feel different from 3 o'clock onward. Her father arrived at 9 with 2 of the people he'd worked with in the early years, old enough now that they moved carefully, but with the particular authority of people who know what they're doing, and they stood in the dining room and looked at it with the eyes of people seeing a place come back rather than arrive, which was a different thing entirely. Elena stood in the middle of the room and looked at her father, who was looking at the kitchen door with an expression she had no name for, too complicated, too layered with time, and she crossed to him and stood beside him and looked at the same door. She would have argued about the menu, her father said. "I know," Elena said. "I'm keeping it anyway." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Close enough. They went to work. On the last evening, before the soft opening, after the suppliers had come and gone, and the kitchen had been tested and the staff briefed and the chairs rearranged twice because the first arrangement wasn't right, and the second one was, Elena sat at the table nearest the window as the afternoon light moved through its 3 o'clock change and turned the room into something warmer than it had been all day. She had the letter in front of her. She'd read it a dozen times by now, enough that she knew the sentences by heart. And tonight she read it once more, all the way through, slowly. The way you read something when you're not looking for information anymore, but for the thing underneath the information, the thing that's been there since the first reading but that you couldn't locate yet because you weren't ready for it. Her mother had written, "I hid this because I was afraid. I want you to know that." What Elena heard in it, reading it now, in the room where her mother had worked for 18 years, was not just the admission of fear but the deliberateness of what had been done with it. The fear had not been paralyzing. The fear had been metabolized into something functional, something that protected people, something that held its shape for 20 years in a metal box under a tile floor until the moment it was needed. That was its own kind of courage. Not the kind that looked like courage from the outside, the kind that looked like an ordinary woman running a kitchen. Elena folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket and looked at the room. Outside the window, the street was doing the thing streets did at this hour, the particular shifting of one kind of afternoon activity into another, the school release foot traffic, the delivery timing changes, the ambient sound of a neighborhood moving through its daily rhythm with the unconscious precision of something that has done this 10,000 times. Ordinary, completely ordinary, the kind of ordinary that holds everything. She sat there until the light changed again, and then she got up and went back to work, because there was still work to do and she was the one to do it, and the room was waiting, and tomorrow was the first day of the thing she was building. Not instead of anything, not in spite of anything, just the next thing, just forward. The door to the kitchen swung behind her, and the dining room held the last of the afternoon light in its windows for another hour before the street outside went to evening, and the Vetter Street restaurant stood in the early spring dark exactly as it had always stood, particular, imperfect, used for something, full of the specific weight of a life that had been lived inside it and the specific lightness of one that was just beginning. The end.